Morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining today. It's great to have you. My name is Catherine Swinney, and I'm one of the workplace health coordinators for the Kenton Medway Healthy Workplaces program. And today our webinar will be talking about musculoskeletal health, which is quite a bit of a mouthful. So you may see me shorten it by saying MSK. We will be covering quite a lot of things. It'll be quite a good overview about what, from a healthy lifestyle perspective, we can do to look after our musculoskeletal health, but just a little bit of housekeeping. If your backgrounds allow, just for the recording's sake, it can be helpful if you can stay on mute, but I do want to encourage as much interaction as we can, so we will be utilizing the chat to answer any questions that you have today. So feel free to pop it in there and I'll make sure I acknowledge it and check it throughout the day. But yeah, so in terms of the webinar, make yourself comfortable. You're attending today because, just as a bit of context, as the Kenton Medway Healthy Workplaces program, we are a free workplace wellbeing scheme that's commissioned by Kent County Council and Medway Council, and we provide training, resources, and support to businesses like your own, and that's why it's been promoted to you today. So it's great to see you. And this is a new series, so we do have a satisfaction survey that will take less than 2 minutes that we'd really appreciate you filling out at the end. I'll pop it in the link in the chat at the end of the session, just because it's a new series and we want to get as much feedback as we can about what you'd like to see going into the fall, as well as how we can improve. So as I mentioned, so what we're going to cover today, we've got 30 minutes. We're going to cover as much information as we can, just to give a bit of an overview around kind of what are musculoskeletal injuries, what are they in the workplace in terms of what causes them, who's most at risk for them, and then from a healthy lifestyle perspective, what are some things that we can all do to sort of improve our musculoskeletal health and help prevent some of those injuries. You will get a copy of the slide deck after today's session, along with this musculoskeletal leaflet that's here on the screen. And after today, the recording will then, I'll put it as a private link on YouTube, and then I'll share that link with you as well, so you've got that to hand. So just to start in with musculoskeletal or MSK injuries, musculoskeletal conditions as a whole is quite a catch-all term. It's an umbrella term for over 200 conditions, actually. And some of those conditions can be things like rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, to things like, low back pain, neck strain. So it's quite a catch-all term. So in terms of today's presentation, what we mean by that is work-related musculoskeletal injuries. So things that are either caused or exacerbated at work. And this visual here on the slide is from the Health and Safety Executive. It just shows sort of how common they are, but in reality, what kind of body parts often are impacted by musculoskeletal injuries. So you'll see in the visual, the most common is your upper limb or neck. So think, RSI, wrist strain, neck strains, things like that are sort of your most common, followed next by back pain. So sometimes that can be caused by lifting something and straining your back, or we'll talk about some of the other patterns that can cause it. And then lower limbs as well, most often impacting your hip or knee joints. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see these sort of average number of days lost by, for each condition. So even though lower limbs are sort of the least common out of the three body areas, they are sort of the most likely to have the longest sort of sickness absence, then followed next by your neck and upper limb injuries, and then your back. So it's all about, we don't want to be out for that long and to have a poor quality of life in general. So we want to focus on what we can do to try to prevent that. So this other visual just shows, if those are the body parts that are affected, how do we get there? What sort of causes it from a work-related musculoskeletal injury point of view? So this other visual just kind of shows that in general, not surprisingly, it's around manual handling. In terms of what sectors are most impacted by musculoskeletal injuries, again, not surprising, it's sort of construction, skilled trade occupations, followed by health and human services. So I know we've got quite a few different NHS trusts here today. day. So manual handling can be a big culprit, but other positions can be things like awkward or tiring positions, keyboard work, or any type of repetitive work, and then just some miscellaneous ones. But my background is in exercise science, so I worked back in the States for over 5 years in exercise, and I've done continuous professional development on exercise and musculoskeletal health. And so what I see on the right-hand side is these sort of working patterns that can cause musculoskeletal problems, and how, as an exercise specialist, how I kind of decode that, what they mean. So if those are the causes, the kind of working environments or working patterns that we can see these things are, is when you're in a fixed or constrained body position. So think if you're at home and you're trying to take minutes in a meeting, maybe you're looking at one monitor to one side, but then you're having to sort of type on the opposite side. So it can be sort of these awkward positions that you may be holding for quite a long period of time. Or again, if you're in the office, even if you're in sort of an awkward position to have to sort of do a certain task for a long period of time. Repetitious movement. So we've all typically have to write emails or do some sort of work on computers nowadays. So a lot of sort of repetition if we're not breaking up those tasks. And then the next thing you know, we've been doing the same sort of typing patterns for hours on end. That can sort of lead to repetition and overuse injuries. Force concentrated on small parts of the body. Again, often your hands and wrists. There's lots of tiny muscles in our hands. And again, we're having to sort of use them quite a lot. So I decode that more as a muscle endurance. So if we're kind of overusing them, it means either the actual demand of our working environments is just not realistic or sustainable for anyone, and or we as an individual can look at how we can have more muscle endurance in lots of these different muscles in our body, so we can sort of keep up to certain demands. So it's things like that. And that last one really speaks to that comment there, where sometimes if you were to lift one heavy box occasionally, with right form, of course, then it would probably be all right. But if you were suddenly put into a situation where suddenly you're having to lift lots of boxes quite frequently, and at a pace that is unsustainable for yourself, then that's when that movement pattern can suddenly be more at risk for musculoskeletal injury. So for yourselves, it's thinking about what kind of working environments you're in, and thinking about, if I'm in more of an administrative role, have I done a desk assessment? If I'm in a different sort of role, have I done any sort of assessments for the type of working tasks that I'm doing to ensure I can either break up periods of sort of awkward positioning, or break up repetitious movements, things like that. There are those that are more at risk for work-related musculoskeletal injuries. So in general, on the left-hand side here, we have some things that we can control, so some things that we can change. We know there's quite a strong link between those that are inactive or sedentary, and those who are more at risk for musculoskeletal injuries. And then also smokers. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slides. But smokers do report having more disabling back pain, and have more musculoskeletal pain and chronic pain compared to non-smokers in the population. And we'll also talk about how our diets can impact our muscle and bone health. So it's no surprise it's going to impact our musculoskeletal health. So if we're not getting the vitamins and minerals we need in our diet, that can influence it. But there are some things that we don't necessarily have as much control over. Those can be certain comorbidities. So we know that those who are obese, about 7 in 10 of adults who are obese, who report having musculoskeletal pain, also have chronic pain. There's a strong link between those who have depression and a higher likelihood of developing musculoskeletal pain. And there is also a genetic component. So again, some of those musculoskeletal conditions that fall under the umbrella term, there is a genetic component to them. When I previously worked with a dietitian and pharmacist sort of on staff in a previous role, I loved a metaphor that they once used, which is when it comes to sort of genetics and likelihood of things, think of it like a light switch. So there may be that possibility, that risk, a higher risk, but it's the left-hand side of the column. It's these healthy lifestyle behaviors that often can sort of turn that switch on or off in terms of how likely we are to actually develop that condition. And then the final component is our age. So as we age, we see more adults report that they have musculoskeletal pain, about sort of for both males and females, sort of 45 years to 55 years were sort of the highest population to have them. But also 3 out of the 10 adults who are over 45 with a long-term condition, so separate long-term health condition, also have a musculoskeletal condition as well. So it's just kind of being aware of what those risk factors are. And if you do feel like you have some of those, thinking about what we can do about it. And that's really what we're going to focus on for the rest of the content, is focusing on what we can control, what we can do. And what we can do from a healthy lifestyle perspective is sort of 4 major areas that influence our musculoskeletal health. So these are having good mental well-being, having, being physically active, having a good nutrient-dense diet and healthy weight, so not putting too much strain on our joints, and not smoking if we do smoke. And the good thing, actually, before I switch slides, the things I just want to mention about that is you'll notice on these 4 healthy lifestyle behaviors that it's not separate from other sort of recommendations for other health conditions like diabetes or heart disease. The thing that can be encouraging is if you're doing things to support your musculoskeletal health, don't feel like you have to do all these other extra things as well for separate conditions. They're all going to have an impact on your total health as well. So just starting off with physical activity. So for each of these kind of topics, we do pretty much have another, Best Me in 30 webinar exclusively for most of these topics because there is so much information. But for this webinar today, we'll kind of be focusing on what are the actual guidelines. Because if we're following the guidelines for each of these kind of healthy lifestyle behaviors, we'll, as adults, we'll pretty much be there to help impact our musculoskeletal health. So the actual, the Chief Medical Officer's physical activity guidelines for adults is around 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, or 75 minutes of vigorous activity, or some combination between the two. If we're focusing specifically on musculoskeletal health, the guidance around how much strength training adults should do or resistance training is about at least 2 days, covering the major muscle groups. That's sort of going to be one of the most effective things from the physical activity guidelines. That's kind of where you're going to get your most bang for your buck when it comes to how much it will impact your musculoskeletal health. Also minimizing sedentary time. So again, breaking up periods of inactivity so we're not in fixed positions for long. And then for older adults, the guidelines also say doing 2 days of balance activities as well. So again, there used to be sort of an older school of thought where it was, if you had if you've hurt your back, if you pulled your back, you should bed rest, just don't do anything, don't exacerbate it, just rest. And actually what we're finding now in the research is that we need to do the opposite. So obviously keeping within the limits of what your body kind of tells you what you can handle. If we're doing strength and resistance training, it's actually going to it has the strongest level of evidence for preventing musculoskeletal injuries. And then it's followed by stretching. And that goes back to those working patterns we talked about. So a lot of the working patterns are more about a muscle endurance, kind of an overuse, origin. So if we're doing things to keep our muscles and bones nice and strong and to keep up with the demands, that's the most helpful. Next, followed by stretching, because that relates to some of the fixed body positions you may be in and any sort of muscle tightness there. So strength first, followed by stretching, and then any, continuing with the rest of the guidelines is still going to be really helpful. The thing I'll say is that if you see that number and you think, I'm not even close to that, don't worry. As little as 10 minutes a day has been found to be helpful. So just start where you can. Some is always going to be better than none, and just build on your success. Squeeze it in where you can, and then look to add more as you build some success from there. In terms of some of those specific muscular considerations, again, we talked about what body parts tend to be most impacted by musculoskeletal injuries. So it's no surprise that these areas in general will be the most helpful when you're doing strength training or resistance training. So again, talking about the upper limb and back, we don't often think about maybe our upper limbs as much when we're doing strength training. So doing any upper back, so that would be things like upright rows where you're sort of squeezing your shoulder blades and then relaxing. Those sorts of things are really going to help strengthen our upper back muscles. And then our neck, again, we don't really think about often training our neck, but actually our heads can be really heavy and we want to have strong necks to support that. As speaking from existence or from experience, as I've had 2 neck strains in the past. So even things when you start with neck exercises, just starting if, for example, if I had a wall behind me and I was sort of flat against the wall and I just sort of pressed my head into the wall. That's what's known as an isometric contraction. So we're not moving up and down or doing a movement like that, but we're still having muscle tension, and it's going to create, make those muscles stronger. So even just starting sort of pressing into a wall and relaxing, doing that for sort of 5-second holds at a time, or then vice versa. If you press your forehead into the wall 5 seconds at a time, those things can help start to strengthen our neck. But equally, if you're just being physically active, you're still going to utilize some of those muscles as well. Shoulders, the shoulder girdle is actually made up of 4 really small muscles. So just again, doing things in general for being physically active, we will still have some sort of stimulus to those muscles to make them stronger. But if you were specifically, wanting to focus on musculoskeletal injury prevention, then these areas are going to be helpful. And then our wrists are the same thing, where we don't often think about training our wrists, but even things, if we're holding things, carrier bags, grocery bags, if we're using them, then those our hands are going to get stronger, our grip strength will be stronger, but also things like just doing body weight wrist curls. So you'd be surprised if you were to do this, for about 15 repetitions, and then doing the opposite, then going upwards. You'll actually start to feel quite a burden for most people, and if you feel like over time that feels easier, then you can start to add just a small amount of weight, something like a tennis ball or a tin of beans or something like that, and trying to do some small repetitions with it can really start to strengthen your wrists and the muscles in your hands there. For back, the core is really important, because we think of the core as the front of our bodies, but actually it's made up of over 20 muscles that can wrap around our back. So that's really important when we think about back injury prevention. But your low back in particular and upper mid back are also going to be important. And then for lower limbs, again, because the hips and the knees are often the joints that tend to be most impacted at the body parts, and doing things for our glutes and doing things for our thighs in terms of exercises for those are going to be really important. Now, dynamic stretching in all of these areas, what I mean by that is there's sort of a couple of different types of stretching. So for example, a static stretch is when I'm holding a position and breathing throughout it. So if I wanted to do a static stretch for my wrist, I would be holding it like this. If I was to do a dynamic stretch, it's often when I'm moving through the stretch. So something like a wrist circle, for example, would be an example of a dynamic stretch for that area compared to holding it. So when we talk about dynamic, again, we want to get mobility to those fixed body positions. So just doing things while we're moving through the stretch to help get the heart rate up and get us warm before we do any exercises is going to be helpful. If you do have any questions along the way, obviously in 30 minutes, I don't know everyone's medical history and can give you an exercise prescription, but I am very happy to answer any sort of general questions you may have about that. And then again, you'll get a copy of these slides, and where I've collated lots of different resources on some physical activity that you can do. So for example, the NHS Fitness Studio, on the NHS website, they've collated lots of different exercise videos that they've created themselves, and they even have the purple hyperlinks on the screen are more of a strength-based focus. So you can find resources around doing a strength training plan for beginners on the NHS Fitness Studio. There's other ones like if you feel like you need a bit more of a structured support, our Parks has a Couch to Fitness program with pre-recorded workouts that you can do over a 9-week period. But they also deliver free live workouts as well. You just filter by their online sort of classes, and they're delivered live. You RSVP and you deliver them over Zoom, and they're out throughout lots of different times a day. So that's an option as well. We had a question in the chat of, are there any stretches for when you first wake up, as that is when I tend to be most stiff in my neck and back? Yeah, so again, when we're lying down for a long period of time, understandably we're resting, but we can sort of get in either awkward positions in our sleep that we're not aware of, or just the general sort of stiffness of waking up. So that's, there are some kind of morning routines that you can follow, but in general, it will be just kind of doing dynamic stretches throughout kind of your body, starting from your head. So doing very light, sort of either half or full neck circles, depending on what feels helpful for you, what feels comfortable for your body, and then moving that on to sort of shoulder circles, doing light, twists into your spine, and then moving into the bottom, lower half of your body as well. That generally will help with just most, loosen up the joints and have a little bit more mobility throughout our body. But if you want a little bit more guidance, the NHS Fitness Studio might be a really helpful link, because it's used for bedtime. They have a bedtime sort of yoga meditation video that you can follow, but equally it would help when you wake up as well. So hopefully that will be helpful. But yeah, so there's lots of resources there. And then in terms of, we mentioned how having a nutrient-dense diet is also going to help us as well. So again, when it comes to diet, the Eat Well Guide is is the recommendations for adults in the UK. And you'll see there's lots of different, it's about kind of really eating the rainbow, so to speak. So making sure we're getting lots of nutrients throughout different food groups. And in general, those who maintain a healthy weight across the lifespan reduce their risk of musculoskeletal conditions like osteoarthritis, for example. So again, it's about following those general guidance, but from a musculoskeletal perspective, there are some nutrients that are most impactful to that. So protein, adults in the UK tend to get more than enough protein in their diets typically. And protein is really important because it helps build and repair muscles. And so it's really important as we're trying to keep our muscles strong. And so in general, when it comes to protein, like we say, most people get enough, but it's about kind of choosing leaner cuts of meat and mince, eating less red and processed meat. If you do eat fish, having ideally aim for 2 portions, one of which is oily, to get some of the omega-3s and 6s that are really helpful. And then incorporate, plant-based proteins as well. So that's your beans, your lentils, your pulses, which are going to offer, a bit of protein, but also be typically lower fat and higher fiber options as well. The other nutrient that's really important from a diet perspective for our musculoskeletal health is calcium. So we've all probably heard, calcium gets strong bones, and it does that. It also helps regulate muscle contractions as well, in addition to keeping our bones healthy, but it also makes sure our blood clots normally as well. So it's a really important nutrient, and we get that in our diets typically through dairy foods, but not necessarily. And so your milks, your cheeses, ice cream, but there are plant-based sources as well. Typically curly kale, okra, spinach sometimes gets thought of as a good calcium source, and it can be, but it doesn't contain huge levels of calcium, and the body can't digest it all. So if you're sort of vegan, vegetarian, it's just being mindful of making sure you're getting enough calcium in your diet. If you do plant-based drinks, it just depends. Lots of different companies that make these plant-based drinks will normally fortify it with calcium or vitamin D, but they may do different amounts. So it's just important to sort of check the label to make sure whichever one you prefer has that. And again, other fortified foods sometimes are breads, and then fish is a really great example of calcium if it's fish that you can eat the bones. So typically your sardines and pilchards, because the calcium is in the bones there. Another nutrient that we say we fall into our diet, but we do actually get it from the sun, is vitamin D. So vitamin D is it goes hand in hand with calcium. It helps regulate the amount of calcium and phosphate in the body. Gets our bones strong, our teeth strong, and helps keep our muscles healthy. There aren't a huge amount of food groups that have a lot of vitamin D in them. And there are some, as we can see on the screen, but most adults in the UK get it through sun exposure. So it's about getting safe sun exposure. We typically get enough exposure to the sun in the summer months, not surprisingly, and we get enough vitamin D from sunlight. It's in the winter months and in the autumn that we typically aren't getting enough, and that's why Public Health England recommends adults to consider taking a vitamin D supplement containing 10 micrograms for the autumn and winter months for adults in the UK, just so we're getting enough and keeping our bones and muscles strong. We also talked about how mental well-being can influence our musculoskeletal health. So again, there's a link between if you have a mental health condition, you might develop a musculoskeletal condition. And equally, if you have a musculoskeletal condition, you may be more likely for certain mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, as we can see on the screen here. So whether or not we have a mental health condition or not, there's things that we can all do to look after our mental well-being. And the sort of visual or one technique to that is is called the 5 ways of well-being. So we can see on the screen, we've got these sort of be active, take notice. That can be through mindfulness exercises or meditation techniques, or just being more present as we're going through our day-to-day routines. Keeping learning, so we're having an element of kind of achievement and things that we can increase our self-confidence in. And having social connections is really important, as well as giving. It doesn't have to be of our financial resources necessarily, but giving of our time, our skills, our attention to others can really help our own well-being as well. The last sort of section is more about things maybe not to do from a healthy lifestyle perspective. So we mentioned briefly how smoking can impact our musculoskeletal health, and that's because smoking reduces the blood supply to our bone. Nicotine also slows the production of new bone cells forming, so that over time we end up making less bone and our bone mineral density decreases. Now this is really important, especially for women as we go through menopause. Our bone mineral density decreases anyway, but also for men as well. So we can see that smokers, even as young as 18 to 20-year-old males, start to have lower bone mineral density compared to their non-smoking peers, and that men can have a 40% increase in hip fractures for those that were smokers compared to non-smokers. So if you feel like that's one of these healthy lifestyle areas that you want to improve upon, we've got some resources of what support stop smoking services are in the area and what support you can access in our resource slide. The final sort of ones that we just want to make aware of is caffeine and alcohol. So they both impact our body's ability to absorb this calcium. So that's why it is really important. This is probably where I get the most questions. So this isn't saying you can never drink tea or coffee again. It's more about a general consensus says anything up to sort of 400 milligrams of caffeine per day is sort of the general consensus to avoid any possible health effects on our bones and cardiovascular health. So a typical tea or coffee is anywhere between sort of 75 to 100 milligrams per cup, depending on how strong you make it. So roughly sort of 4 cups a day is still going to be fine and fit into a healthy diet, and will count towards your hydration levels per day as well. Now, alcohol, again, also impacts our body's ability to absorb calcium, but also to absorb vitamin D. So again, it is really important, and the general recommendation is to follow the Chief Medical Officer's low-risk alcohol guidelines, which is to have no more than 14 units a week for men and women. It used to be different for men and for women. It's now all the same, no more than 14. And if you are having that amount up to the 14, it's important to spread it out over multiple days, and then to have at least 2 drink-free days per week. Those are sort of the general recommendations there. And we've got more resources as well. So just to sort of wrap up before we go, we've talked about a lot of different things that we can do from a healthy lifestyle perspective that can influence our health. What we encourage you to do today, and I'd love to have it in the chat if you're happy to share, is just to identify what's one area, what's one small thing that you can do today to improve your musculoskeletal health. Start small with it, then build up gradually, and make sure that if there is anything new that you're doing and it's a new habit, it's always really important to have a bit of support, a bit of accountability, to get you going, to keep you started as you're building on that success. So if you are happy to share in the chat, we'd love to sort of hear what's one thing that you think you want to take away from today's session. But then just as a wrap up, when it comes to work-related musculoskeletal injuries, it can affect, typically our upper limbs, our lower limbs, neck and back. So it's being aware of what sort of working patterns you're in and if they're more at risk for them, and making sure that from a healthy lifestyle perspective, we can be active, have a nutrient-dense diet, manage our mental well-being, and not smoke if we do smoke, all to support our good musculoskeletal health. So there are lots of resources. Again, I won't go through all of them because you'll get the slide deck after today's session as well as the recording. But we've highlighted some general information for each topic as well as local support services if you want some more support, if that's one of the areas that you want to improve upon. And then I'll just leave this up on the screen here. So this is our 2-minute satisfaction survey. We do have one more webinar for our summer series, which is in mid-July, which is on bone health. And then we're starting to plan out what topics we want to cover in our autumnal series starting in September. So if you do have any topics you'd like to see in the future, we would love to hear from you, and you can put it in the chat now or put it in our satisfaction survey up on the screen here. And if you do have any questions, then you can contact us at workplacehealth@medway.gov.uk. But thank you so much for attending today. I think we're sort of 1 minute past, so not too bad. Thank you. I really appreciate you all taking time out of your days to attend, and I hope it's been useful for you. Enjoy the rest of your day, you all. I'll go ahead and stop the recording, so if people do have any questions they'd like to ask me, you can go ahead and ask me.